with us with that extra experience from the very beginning. Alex has been deputy returning officer for a year now, and so Alex has been working very hard and, in my view, very effectively to put in some of these really important building blocks very early on. So I'm certainly not coming in now in autumn 18 starting things from scratch. All the work that I would expect to see at this stage of the process is in train. But that's the structure that we're working on to. And then in the elections, London Elect's work streams, again, we've got a number of work streams building on work that we have done before. So these cover everything around legislation and guidance that we're working to, all of our work around marketing and use of the web, media work, not now but later, of course, starts ramping up, work around the venues that we're going to use for the counts, the training that we need to do, the work we need to do on fees and charges. And importantly, I think you'd have seen this in the paper, there are names already against a lot of these work streams because work is already underway. And we're running, like we did in 2016, an elections working group, chaired now by myself, but Alex has been chairing that group so far to make sure that everything we need to achieve for the election, both in terms of London Elects, but working in partnership with the boroughs, the Electoral Commission and our suppliers, is done in the way it needs to be done. You may well want to come back to the detail of some of these structures later in questions. I also wanted to give you an overview of the work we have done in terms of looking at the lessons learned from 2016. And there, of course, there were a number of reports into the various issues in 2016, but these couple of slides focus on the lessons that you arrived at and the recommendations you arrived at in the Oversight Committee in the immediate aftermath. And again, I'm not running through them one by one, but talking about some of the highlights. So we are using, as I've said, a very similar approach to resourcing in 2020 with a range of improvements, which I will go through. You talked in the report into 2016 about the quality assurance framework that the GLA team uses with the boroughs and the Electoral Commission and others, and we had a conversation with the Electoral Commission just last week to all the people working on the election. And certainly in 2016 there was a bit of misalignment between the guidance of the Electoral Commission and the guidance that was coming out of this building, which is never helpful, but we established last week that the guidance related to the 2020 London elections will be developed jointly between us and the Commission, and work on that will start in the next few weeks. And I think that's a very, very helpful agreement with the Commission. They will remain, of course, a regulator as well, and they will take a view afterwards, as you will, as to how well the election was run. But we've agreed that, with that regulatory role there, of course, all other work will be done in partnership with them for the 2020 elections. We already understand that we are not to expect any substantive legislative change. This very senior legal advisor already retained for the election to work for me as the returning officer. And as we get a bit closer, we will review whether we need any other dedicated capacity with elections experience for the night. But I think we are already much better placed than 2016. And then, of course, the other risk that was live when you reviewed the 2016 elections was the possibility of a combined London and general election, because of course at the time the general election was going to be in 2020. So events have somewhat overtaken that, but we cannot assume that there won't be another big election coinciding with ours in 2020. We could never assume that. And so we are doing some risk analysis and some contingency planning around that in any event. So coming on to our current focus, we are at the very end of our procurement process of the provider who will support us with the Ecounting services. I can't tell you, we're now at preferred provider. We are waiting for a signed contract to be returned to us, and then I will be able to announce who our Ecounting partner is. But we are extremely close. I'd hoped to be able to have that news for you this morning, but we are almost there. We have reserved the 3 venues that you've used, obviously, for a long time now, for the counts across London. We are actively recruiting a number of key London Elects roles, including the venue directors for those 3 venues, and making sure that the boxes on all the key work streams get filled in with names, if not before Christmas, very, very shortly afterwards. We've had early meetings with both the Electoral Commission and the Cabinet Office last week, and all 3 of us were there. They were very constructive. And we have got a first meeting with all of our constituency returning officers and the borough returning officers in January. We've got the date of that set. And we want to use that to really cement with them the respective roles and responsibilities of all of our partners in this election. The e-count provider will be there with us. The Electoral Commission are coming as well. We've invited the Cabinet Office. I want all partners together in the same room mid-January, being very clear about roles and responsibilities, and being able to give to them as much of the information that they need at this point to be able to deliver with us. My reflections as a constituency returning officer in the last 2 elections is that not all of that information has always been available as early as really the boroughs need it. Now that we know we haven't got legislative change to deal with, we can provide actually a lot of information much earlier, and that's absolutely my intention to do that. The other thing I should probably say is that the boroughs have been running for a few years now an elections management board to try and make sure that elections are run as well as possible across London, whichever elections they are. I used to sit on that myself as one of the chief executives most interested in elections, and the 3 of us are joining that board on the 5th of December again. So we meet the senior election managers and the senior chief execs most interested in elections, and again, work with them to plan the January meeting, so we know we've got support before we go in. And I know all the returning officers right now across London. Lee knows all the election managers across London, so we're in a good position. This is what we're focusing on over the next 6 months, and I thought I might put these up in front of you now, so if you'd like us to come back in about 6 months' time and tell you how we're getting on, you can hold me to account for some of these things that we said we would get done. So as soon as we can, we've got a contract with our e-counting provider. Of course, the serious work starts with them. But a programme of testing, because we know testing was one of the problems that caused the problems last time, and training with everybody who's going to be interacting with that system. We have got to procure the election booklet, the booklet that goes to every elector, not just every household, every elector. And that's our next big procurement. But there are other procurements that need to get underway, not least the fitting out of the count centres themselves, and lots of sort of polling station material. We have already commissioned some work to get the London Elects website updated. It's not going to look that different than it has previously. I mean, you might have a view on that, but I think actually it's a very good website. but we need to make sure it's keeping up with people's expectations, and the infrastructure can support that. I've talked about confirming the respective roles and responsibilities with the boroughs. Of course, one of the things the boroughs need to know very quickly is what finance are we going to allow them to run the elections for us. We've got this joint guidance I've talked about with the Electoral Commission, which Lee is going to lead on developing jointly with them. Performance framework standards with the Electoral Commission, again we've talked about that, and we've got to get all London Elects roles appointed to in those next 6 months. So the workstream leads are now, and then the roles underneath are next. Risks. Now there are a whole load of risks associated with running an election of this scale. And we have a developing risk register that I suspect you'll want to talk to us in more detail continually between now and 2020. But these are the big ones, of course. We've got some really important procurements to complete. We're almost there with probably the biggest one of all, which gives us some comfort, but we've got to get there to be able to get a contract signed and that announced. We clearly have significant dependence on our suppliers, not least the Ecounting supplier, but others too, and we need to stay very alive to the state of play with them as companies and as going concerns, as well as partners in this election. We've had, of course, or you've had before, disruption to count venues on the day, but of course we need to make sure that they are able to deliver what they are contracting with us to do on the day, and probably as well for an event this size, insufficient resourcing, whether here or whether in the boroughs or whether with our partners, again, is probably one of our biggest headline risks. Taken off at the moment a big coinciding election in 2020. I mean, there will be by-elections in the boroughs that we will need to be hosting in the count centres. There always are. But again, you might want to debate whether we should put that risk back on or not. But we are definitely doing some contingency planning about combined elections. So, Chairman, that was my sort of presentation to get us going.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mary. That was quite comprehensive. I mean, there are a range of questions that we're going to ask. I suppose the obvious starting point from me really is that when you did your review, when you did your preparation for the presentation you've just given us, how does what you're proposing differ from what was done previously? The reason for the question is that, obviously, as you can imagine, members take an interest in the elections every time they are held, and every time they are held, we ask officers about their preparedness for it, and we have assurances about mitigating risk and everything else. And then it seems that every single election, something comes out from left field, and we have a satisfactory outcome, but an unsatisfactory process to getting the satisfactory outcome. So how does your proposal differ from what's gone before?
Well, I'll answer that. Alex, more detail might want to come in. I think the primary difference clearly is we have actively built in all the recommendations from last time. And I think those recommendations went beyond actually some of the things that obviously went wrong. They were quite a wide-ranging set of recommendations. I know my predecessor, Jeff, wrote to Assemblymember Duval, was in the chair, I think, at the time, reassuring the committee that those lessons would be taken on board. And as I then was appointed and started talking to Alex, it was absolutely clear to me that they have been. So I think that clearly is a starting position for difference. I think that the bringing on of elections expertise into the London Elects team so early is clearly a difference. And And again, Alex got on with that, and I was delighted to hear Lee had been appointed into that role. I think that puts us in actually quite a different position in terms of understanding what is ahead of us and the risks that we need to manage. I also intend to work even more closely with the boroughs than has been done previously. I think there was good collaboration with the boroughs last time, but I do think it could be much closer. And I think we are in a good position to do that between us. I also know that both the Electoral Commission and the Cabinet Office were very pleased to be asked to come in here last week so early in the process, because I think, again, working with them in partnership behind the scenes early on is going to be, that will be different this time as well. And you know, if we have problems, really need those partners absolutely with us to help solve them, and that's also what I want to be different this time.
Okay. You touched in your last slide on a couple of key risks that you'd identified, one of which was insufficient resourcing. Now in that, did you mean insufficient resourcing of personnel or money, or both?
I'm confident in the budget that we've got. We've got enough financial resource. Elections are always difficult to staff. I think you will know this, I think, particularly those of you perhaps that have been in boroughs and have seen the process at first hand. I think there are local government has had to take money out of services. We know that in some places elections teams are now very small. I'm looking to lead. And we also know that boroughs need to call on armies of people to staff polling stations and then to come to the counts. And it's that resource, really, I think, that we need to make sure is absolutely in place and properly trained. Because people need to be identified very early on who are going to be working with the elections. These aren't people who can just show up on the morning of the polling or the morning of the count to support. So it's really making sure, I think, that we have the right resource here, and we're busy trying to identify the people who will sign up, and that all the boroughs feel that they can do the same. And if boroughs feel they have going to struggle to do that, I think that's what I mean about the close working. I want people to be telling us that really early on, and us being able to do whatever we can to support them. Elections are challenges, particularly staffing polling stations and staffing counts, and there's no way we can get away from that. And we are relying on 33 boroughs to be get themselves adequately resourced. I'm sure they will. There's enormous understanding of people's responsibilities. That's why constituency returning officers have their own responsibilities here. And my experience from running elections is that there's an awful lot of goodwill among staff to step away from their day jobs and join in the effort. But there are hundreds, thousands of people supporting the delivery of this election in 2020, and that's the challenge.
The other risk that you touched on, which certainly made my ears prick up, was the possibility of another election on the same day. Now, of course, the only election that there could be on the same day is a general election, and that would involve a multitude of different electoral systems being deployed at the same time and counted in completely different ways as well. How can you mitigate that, should that happen? Because you won't get a huge amount of warning of that happening. At best, you might get a couple of months before polling day that there's going to be a general on the same day. So how will you be flexible enough to accommodate that without the ball being dropped on the day?
Well, we're going to have a plan. You know, a fairly well-developed plan as to what we would do. And it's going to have to be a plan developed with the Electoral Commission and with the Cabinet Office. So, coming out of 2016, of course, and before the election, the general election in 2017, it was understood by everybody that 2020 was going to be a combined election. And it's fair to say, I think, is that there was a lot of concern about that and how that would be achieved. Because you know, there's legislation that says, for example, that the count for a general election must start 4 hours after the polls have closed. So boroughs would be counting their general election results from all night on the Thursday night. So you know, the plan to arrive at 8 a.m. to do the mayoral and assembly counts across London would have to change. That it just wouldn't be possible. It's the same people doing all the jobs. So there was a lot of concern at the time. Everyone, I think, then went phew. But of course now we need to get into some proper planning for what if it was indeed the case.
Can I just add to that?
So yes, so there's planning already underway.
Sorry, Chair, yes. I need to add to that as well that the Association of Electoral Administrators London branch are working up a paper now to address the issues about a combined election, which they're going to present to their branch meeting in December, and which we're feeding into. So we'll have a lot more information on the risks of a combined election following that December meeting. But we're certainly working up the plan.
Will that be a public document?
It will be, yes.
Will you be able to distribute it to us then, please?
Certainly.
And we can send it around the committee. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, other than the two that I've picked up, Mary, what are the key risks that you see now, this far from the election, and what are you doing to mitigate them?
I think getting the e-counting services provider up and running and everybody beginning to build some confidence in that and the system. So the risk of that not getting up to speed as we have planned, I think, is a risk. I think we have mitigated that well through our selection of provider and also some of the plans that we have already got in place for kicking off the work with them and getting them up and running. So I think that is probably one. It is a risk if we don't get that right. I think that would probably be my biggest one in the immediate time, because we need to build confidence in the provider that we have selected, and they need to build confidence across that stakeholder partner group in their ability to deliver and in their intention to collaborate as we need them to. But I don't know whether the two of you want to say anything.
No, I think that's quite correct.
About that. So that would be my number one.
Okay, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about partnership, because that is a key part of this. Assembly member, did you want to ask a question before we move on to that?
I did too, yeah. Just a quick.
Sorry?
Before, yeah, I think your supplementary question as well.
Right, Assembly member Desai.
Yeah.
Just one question, Chair. I think that was a very detailed presentation, Ms. Harpley, and to a large extent you touched upon the issues I was going to raise with you about the role of the boroughs. I mean, you talked working very closely with the boroughs, and you also said you're confident about the budgetary processes sort of overall. But to ask you very specifically, how confident are you that the boroughs from their side will commit the necessary resources that you think will be required? When you talk about budgetary processes, you were talking about, from, as I understood you, from this side of the equation. But what about the other side?
So I'm confident they will, but we are yet to have, the detailed conversation with them. That's what we're going to be doing in January. Which was the question to them is going to be, well, the resource you need, because they're running elections the whole time. You know the resource that is required. To what extent are they confident or not of being able to deliver it? That is going to be one of my questions for the constituency returning officers and borough returning officers. And I think you know, I mean, this is one of the complications of this election, but there are very clear requirements, responsibilities in statute laid out for constituency returning officers. You know, it is their job to ensure that the election in their constituency runs absolutely as it should, and as absolutely key to that, of course, is the provision of the resources that are needed. So, you know, there is an obligation on them, and they need to work with the borough returning officers in the 2 other boroughs to make sure that's delivered. So I am confident that everybody will absolutely understand that that is their role. But as we know, resources in boroughs to different extents have been cut. And so part of the question in January will be, well, where are your concerns? Share them now, will be the discussion that we're in.
Assembly Member Berry, did you want to point?
Yeah, just on the coincident elections question. You said you're doing a paper that's going to come out in December on the potential of that. Obviously, May 2020 is a potential candidate date for referendums as well. I think we had no role in the last referendum at a London-wide level. But in terms of you mentioned for the general election, for example, that it has to be counted within a certain time. Presumably for things like referendums, which are quite unique, that's negotiable, and we might be planning to negotiate.
Yes, although that would be negotiated on a national level, wouldn't it? Because we'd all have to do the referendum at the same time.
But places with coincident elections could argue for the count to be done the next morning or at a different time. So when we're counting our own elections, for example, we could maybe argue for that.
Are we speaking hypothetically?
Yes,
or
completely.
referendum that you know
Speaking about risks, Chair.
In case there's a referendum.
In case there is a referendum.
We have it more regularly these days.
You're wishing for a risk, Sean, obviously.
Okay.
It's May 2020 would be, if looking at things as they currently stand, is a definite candidate for there being a potential.
Nothing to do with anything. It's ridiculous.
Calm down, Peter.
I think there's a theoretically logistical
Talking about
question to
risks.
ask. If we ended up with an election and referendum as well as the GLA, I think that's fine.
It's fine.
We need to be planning for the combination with either a general election or another event. I think is fine.
I agree with referendums, not election.
Okay.
You would, wouldn't you? Staring at everything.
Hang on. Let's move on. It's quite an emotionally raw day. Let's focus on the matter in hand. So let's move on to the next question, which is actually Assembly Member Whittle.
General election would be a nightmare.
Morning, Mary. Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. It seems that one of the dedicated work streams is about marketing, obviously, of the elections. How will you try to boost voter registration? This is obviously crucial. I know that there are various things which mean that as I understand, the GLA cannot actually directly, as it were, fund, but you can work with bodies, can't you? So I just wonder whether you could tell us how you're going to market, how you are going to promote registration, and for that matter, who you would be working with.
Right. Okay, so as the Greater London Returning Officer, I am not going to be promoting registration.
Right.
In fact, I cannot.
Okay.
So that's the first thing to say.
That was my second question. Actually.
Yes.
Isn't there a conflict of interest?
Yes, so I can't, as the returning officer, I can't. And as you know, it is the boroughs, through their electoral registration officers, whose responsibility it is to promote registration and make sure that their registers are as complete as possible. So, so that's, there's sort of two fairly clear statements. We have no role as a GLA for registration. However, we in the GLA are able, if we wish, to promote awareness and registration in conjunction with others. We cannot do it as a self-standing exercise with just the GLA. So, and this is, this is all very clearly set out, and in fact, again, before I arrived, Alex and others very helpfully got the most up-to-date sort of legal guidance on that for me coming in. But of course, we know that registers in London aren't as complete as they might be, although boroughs do work very hard on registers, and we certainly could consider working with the boroughs, with the Electoral Commission, to promote registration in advance of the 2020 elections, if we choose to do that. So, to be honest, at the moment, I've focused on making sure that the plans for the election itself look in the right place, and they do. I know there are some thoughts in the GLA about potentially participating in a registration awareness programme with boroughs, but that is very early thinking at the moment, and Lee and others will need to talk to the boroughs about that and see whether that's something that they wish to do. And then I will need to come and talk to the Mayor's office and to the Assembly about whether that's something that people want to support.
So it would be with with the boroughs, etc. I was thinking, would there be other organisations, maybe, people who want to promote greater voter participation? Could you get together with them? Would you work with them? I'm not thinking of any particular ones. You would know more than I would.
Well, I think the answer is potentially. It is clear that if the GLA is to support any work, it needs to be in collaboration with others and in a sort of coordinating and facilitating role of others.
I see.
But I think we're going to probably have a conversation about this on the 5th of December at the Election Management Board. We did talk to the Commission a little bit about what they're going to be doing around promoting registration awareness linked to the London election particularly. And of course their view is constantly reminding us that they're not just for London, you know, they have a national remit as well. So I think it's something that we should certainly think about as the GLA, but as I said, only in collaboration with others, and of course, you know, from my point of view, taking my returning officer hat off for a moment, only with the support of both the Mayor's office and the Assembly.
So with your other hat on, your non-returning officer hat, how would you market election? I mean, how are you going to market elections, as it were? How, apart from the voter registration part, you want to market the elections? Have you had any thoughts on that? I mean, what I was thinking, for example, is that it's 2020. That is a big anniversary, isn't it, for this place? I mean, I'm not trying to sound too commercial here, but I'm just thinking surely that could be linked in. This is, you know, this is what we are. Maybe just in case you don't know, and this is why you should vote for us. You know, something like that. You know?
I think the honest answer is we haven't yet given very much thought to that, because we're not going to do that too far in advance of 2020.
No, sure.
But that's something that we will be thinking about.
The only point is you need to just tread a little carefully, I know from last time on the London Elects website, between striking that balance between explaining what it is that City Hall does in precise and neutral terms, and not getting into what this particular administration may be doing. And I think we'd be very mindful of that when we're sort of promoting anything on the website. So I'm sure that, again, we'll want to run the kind of explainers that we ran last time that say, why does your vote matter? Because this is what City Hall is responsible for. Just need to be very careful with the language around that.
What was the kind of, is there any money for this? I mean, this particular part of the work?
That's built into the budget. Yeah. That is part of the budget, the marketing and web.
What kind of budget are we talking about? How much?
It's not big.
No, it's not big, certainly, but it's
not big.
It's not big at the moment, no. But as I say,
what's that then? What? How much?
I don't know. I wouldn't like to guess off the top of my head, I'm afraid. But we're still developing this whole strategy, and as it develops, we'll be looking at the funding issue and perhaps how we can generate more funds towards any marketing. As I say, we're still in the embryonic stages this part of it at the moment.
One of the things the Mayor does have access to is, you know, the spaces on the commercial spaces on the tube and so on, which again we've tended to use at election time, so there's a valuable resource there.
I mean, I think clearly, so put registration aside for a minute, because that is absolutely not our role, but when it comes to making sure that people across London know this election is happening, that is absolutely part of our job. And, you know, nearer the time, we'll be developing the materials that we need on the web to make that clear.
I'll ask one point, just a point of fact, actually, my own information. What percentage of Londoners voted last time in 2016? Do you know, off the top of your head?
56.
Just under 50% in my head, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank
Okay,
you.
Assembly Member Berry.
46.1.
46.1.
46.1.
A bit under.
I just wanted to follow on that point. I've noticed that you have said in your report that you're going to do more to explain the supplementary vote. Now, that's the mayor election. There was evidence that we saw that there was also some confusion and about the assembly election system, that you know, the two different ballot papers and all of that. And last time, I think one of the things we commented on when we reported on this after 2016 was that last time there were not any specific bits of marketing about the posters on the tube about the assembly election, that they were all the marketing was kind of combined elections, and that in previous years, in 2012 for example, there had been particularly, you know, election posters explaining that there was an assembly election, that there were two ballot papers, part of it was that's something I think that we discussed in our report, whether you haven't responded to. You've only mentioned the supplementary vote, which is the mayor election.
So the slides I had on the lessons from last time were explicitly the explicit recommendations that were made at the end of the report, which I don't think did talk about that, but did talk about the supplementary vote. But so I don't know if anybody knows.
It was certainly discussed as part of our
Yes,
investigation.
no, yes, yeah, that's so. Well, it seems to me that as we know, there are sort of three elections in effect happening, aren't there? Three different ballot papers and votes, and we need to make sure that people, one, properly understand that and properly understand the assembly side of the election as well. So I don't know if anybody knows why there was a change of tack between 12 and 16, but definitely we need to make sure that people, you know, that is part of our job, to make sure that one, people know the elections are happening, and two, they understand what they're being asked to vote on, and you know how the different papers work, and the rest of it. That is absolutely part of the returning officer's role. So we'll take that into the planning.
On that subject, anecdotally, and I don't have anything in front of me to prove this, but certainly in the early mayoral and assembly elections, the number of spoiled ballot papers was very significantly high because people were not used to the electoral systems that were being used. I think, and I stand to be corrected, I'm looking for some data from you on this, in the 2016 election, it was at an all-time low in terms of mayoral and assembly elections. Am I correct in that? And is there any data that you have that you could circulate to the committee on that? Because I think Assembly Berry is getting at something that's important, which is that if people don't understand how this system works, they will spoil their ballot papers unintentionally. And that is obviously disenfranchising people, which is something we really must avoid. But I think we were on the right tracks in 2016. Do you have any data that shows me to be right on that or wrong on that?
You can dig it.
We certainly will have the data, which we can supply.
When we I'll send you some of
Just
when we write in, perhaps we'll just sweep that up in the letter and you can then write back to us. Assemblyman Copley, then Berry.
To clarify that recommendation 3 doesn't specify just the mayor election at all. It talks about the elections as a whole.
Assemblyman Copley.
If I remember rightly, that there certainly was an issue where in the mayoral election people would just put a cross and it would be in the second preference box, and their ballot paper would have been deemed to have been spoilt because they didn't cast a first preference. Is that still the case? And it is.
There's been no change, and there's no anticipated change to the rules at all at the moment. So yes, it is still the
Which
case.
is a bit unfortunate, but
Yes.
I mean, if Assemblyman Bacon is right and people have just got more used to the system, that's obviously positive. But if there are still people just casting a second preference and losing their vote, that's still concerning.
And I think, as Mary alluded to, that's one of our key conversations going forward about how we try to address that, certainly.
This government did put in their manifesto pledge to, I think, review use of second preference votes full stop. But again, one of the discussions we've had with the Cabinet Office is clear there's not going to be legislative time for them to look at these things.
I think there are various things in the manifesto that have since, well, how do you put it politely?
Fallen by the wayside.
Not come into public prominence since the general election. Let's not dwell on that. Let's move on. Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. Morning. On the morning of the 2016 GLA elections, Barnet unfortunately failed to issue a complete voter register to its presiding officers. As a result, some 1,600 potential voters were disenfranchised. What steps are you taking to reassure Londoners that that doesn't happen again?
Well, that particular problem, as we said in the presentation, right across London, people have taken steps to put in extra checks around the registers. Systems have been changed, the management systems, because of course that problem originated in the system. Somebody checked the wrong box in the system. So I think there have been changes to the systems. There have been checks put in. And also, as I mentioned just earlier, there are now routinely logbooks at polling stations. Because of course the other problem was when the new registers came, that there weren't lists of people who had to leave the polling station who could be contacted to say, actually, if you wish to come back, you've now got the registers. So, I think always with these things, when a problem happens, a lot of work is then done to address that problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't stop another problem bubbling up. But in terms of quality of registers, Lee, I don't know whether you want to say anything more. I think a lot of work has been done.
I think I can speak from personal experience from Croydon, for example. After the Barnet experience, it certainly became a key risk for us, as it did for any other London borough. We put steps in place to ensure that it, as best it can, that it wouldn't happen locally. The electoral service management teams and the suppliers of the systems have also put in other key strokes to make sure that you can't just press a button and press the wrong register, which quite simply is what Barnet boiled down to. So there's lots of key steps now in the process to try and eradicate that happening again. And I think, again, as Mary's alluded to, obviously once one borough's made that mistake, it sticks with every other borough, and it's very unlikely that that would happen again. And also, as I say, there's all these checks and balances now within these ESM systems, management systems, to try and stop that from happening. So, yes.
So do we have the reassurance from the other boroughs that they are as diligent as Croydon, for instance?
Yeah, I can say from a London perspective, because I'm a member of the Association of Elected Administrators London-wide, it has been a key issue since 2016, and it's been addressed at every borough, certainly because nobody, of course, by the grace of God, wants to be in that situation. So yes, it is it's a risk that's been dealt with.
I was going to say that I served as a presiding officer in the local elections earlier this year, and certainly as a result of the events of 2016, part of the briefing and the training was an increased emphasis on the presiding officer checking that the voting electoral register accorded with what you were expecting to see, with the correct numbers of names and addresses, and as I said, the logbook, just literally that, of course, if in the event somebody was to come in and was unable to vote, or you couldn't find their details, you will take down those details, and in the event you're able to resolve the issue, then you can contact them, which again was one of the issues that came out of Barnet, wasn't it, that there was, if people had taken down the emails or the mobile numbers, it might have been possible to have let them know quite early that the issue had been resolved.
And can I just add to that, another issue, another key step we're trying to take is to ensure consistency across the board, pan-London, that each borough produces a logbook that's consistent across all of London, and that will record incidents in a consistent manner to help us report back post-event. So we're also looking at that as well. So.
Can I just move on? And Chair, stop me if this is mentioned later on. Voter identification and voter fraud is a big issue. Certainly in some boroughs particularly. Have you made any approaches to the government in relation to the introduction of possible voter identification, as voter fraud is so bad in London?
No, is the answer. We haven't made any approaches. Yes, so we do know, I think you may have seen that the Cabinet Office has recently announced a further 11 or 12 voter ID pilots for the elections happening in 2019. And of course those are all over the country. So we spoke to the officials from the Cabinet Office about those, and they are expecting to learn more from those pilots. From our discussions with him, there are no intentions to run further pilots in 2020 for voter ID.
I think it might be worth having a conversation in relation to possible pilots in those areas, especially where we know that voter fraud is prolific. Would that not be a responsible thing to do?
Well, I think I'm certainly not planning to approach them. I think if we've talked about the complexity of this election already, if we have different ways of working in different boroughs in 2020, I think that will be a level of complexity too far. You know, the integrity of the ballot, of course, is absolutely key, and there's a responsibility on all the constituency returning officers and the borough returning officers to work with their local police and others around integrity. And again, there's huge amounts of work that does happen. I think that's what we need to focus on. So yes, it's not my intention as the RO to approach government and ask for that type of activity in 2020.
Right, so what you're saying then is, as the returning officer for London, you are aware of prolific voter fraud, and you have no plans to do anything about it. I think that's quite concerning for the people of London.
I didn't say I was aware of prolific voter fraud.
Are you saying that you're not aware of the instances that voter fraud occurred in Tower Hamlets?
Yes, I'm
so
aware of what's occurred, but what I'm saying is that... So you asked me whether I'm going to approach the government to ask for further ID pilots in 2020, and I'm saying that that is not my intention. I know that there are more pilots next year, the 11 that have just been announced. If the government runs a further set of pilots in 2020 and London is asked to participate in that, that's a different question, isn't it? And that's where we have presumably have to have a view as whether or not that's what we wanted to participate in, if indeed we were being given the choice.
My question is quite simply, you as the returning officer, probably the returning officer for the 2020 election, are fully aware that voter fraud occurs quite prolifically in London. And I am concerned, on behalf of the people of London, that you, at this moment in time, are making no provision or making no approaches to do anything about it. I think that is a grave concern to the people of London, that you know that it occurs, and that you have made no provision to date, and you have no plans to make any provisions to see what can be done to prevent voter fraud. And that concerns me greatly.
Can I just reply? So I think that it is the responsibility, and always has been, of the returning officers to make sure that as far as they possibly can, the integrity of the election is maintained. And returning officers, and I've been one of them across London, do an awful lot of work to ensure that.
Some don't.
In terms of our election, that responsibility falls on the constituency returning officers. And, you know, I will, of course, be working hard with them on issues of integrity. I think in terms of ID pilots and voter ID, we need to wait for the work that the government is doing on that. And so, as I say, 11 further pilots next year, from which our Cabinet Office, the team that we met, said that, you know, the intention is to learn more from those. And then we need to see where they want to go in 2020.
Okay. I think we need to keep an eye on that one. Now, in order, I've seen Assemblymember Desai and then Assemblymember Berry. Assemblymember Desai, did you still want to come in? Because I think part of what you were about to ask was covered, wasn't it?
It has been good. I was just going to say, Chair, that perhaps it would be wise to get the advice of people like Mr. Tuckley from Dower Hamlets, who's had some experience with these issues. I was going to raise this earlier, but Senator Prince's questions prompted me to raise this point. And also the Police and Crime Committee, in another context, has actually looked at all these issues as well. Perhaps you might wish to go back to some of our deliberations.
Yes, there is some substantial experience in London.
Assemblymember Berry.
Just to say that I would have thought that there are many ways of tackling the voter fraud that we've discussed, and we've discussed it at length in the Police and Crime Committee, including the extra scrutiny given to the veracity of the electoral registers, for example, that's been talked about. And I think it's potentially quite a political argument that you just made, saying that by not supporting voter ID, you're taking no action in respect of the kind of fraud that we've discussed before. So I just wanted to make sure that that point was made alongside your point, which was made.
I think we will note that comment. What we're not here to do is debate amongst members. We're here to take
maybe that's something we can do in the plenary meeting at some point.
That would indeed be entirely the right place to do that. I saw something over
No, it's fine.
Okay, fine.
I was going to continue the debate, and you've quite rightly said that we shouldn't be doing that. So.
I've always liked you, Tom, and there's reasons for that. Right, we're going to move on to Assemblymember Shaw.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm sure practically all of us will remember what happened at last GLA and mayoral election in terms of massive delay in announcement of mayoral result. And that actually, that happened because there was delay in announcing Brent and Harrow constituency result. So I was the one who initially had to put up with, 2-3 hours delay. It was a complete chaos. The delay was entirely due to technical problems with ballots. Now, this is something obviously is of major concern. We're always told that, e-counting is, absolute next thing after sliced bread. You'll be done and dusted by about 7, 8 o'clock. It's never happened in 12 years that I have known of. So this is major concern. So I know that you're diligently looking at recruiting the partner for e-counting. Now, the question is, given the technical complexities with the e-counting process, what support will you have if there's a technical problem like we had last time around during the count? Let's start with that.
So you're right, and it's something that we, when Mary talked earlier about how our focus of work so far this year has very much been around the procurement of e-counting and related services. And we've kind of stopped, rather than sort of dusting down and rewriting the procurement used 8 years ago, we did do a pretty comprehensive rewrite, which particularly focused on some of the issues that were in the Assembly report around transparency, but also the need for sort of greater testing, including GLA officers' involvement in that testing, and the as again Mary alluded to, us recruiting somebody with some sort of elections expertise to be able to meaningfully test that what the contractors are saying to us is correct. But fundamentally, this is a complicated business, having the right kind of relationship with the contractor and the partner so that we can be testing, the so-called agile methodology as we go along, aim to pick up problems like the problem that emerged on election night much earlier, so that these problems sort of don't arise. Will the exact same IT problem that happened in 2016 happen in 2020? That seems unlikely given the amount of testing we'll be doing around that now. Can we absolutely guarantee that the counting of sort of 6 million votes is not going to be completely free of problems of one sort or another? No, I don't think we can, but we're going to do everything we can to try and mitigate those problems in advance, and working up a programme of testing and training now with the contractor is the means by which we're doing that, and we're bolstering our IT capability to help us.
We are going to have our own IT person in the London Elects team, who will be very, very familiar with the system and the technology, and that's what was missing in 2016. Wasn't it? That's what we will have in 2020.
No, I do absolutely welcome the approach where
That's
you're
your
going to have the
recommendation.
independent e-counting project manager or project officer. So that certainly is a step in the right direction. But the question is, what kind of relationship there will be between the independent project manager for e-counting and the contractors who will actually be providing the equipment and running the accounting process itself?
So that's a good question, and that's one of the things that is a priority for the next few weeks. So we're almost procured the provider.
You have that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so that's the one where the contract's gone out, needs to come back signed, and then we can announce who it is.
Yeah.
We have got an advert out already to recruit the e-count manager.
When is that likely to happen? When will the person be in place, you reckon?
Interviews next week. There we go. There we
okay.
go. Because the two need to come together. Because
Indeed.
the whole purpose is that we
yeah.
have our independent officer available from the moment, really, pretty much the moment, that the e-count provider starts working with us.
Yeah.
Quite how that will work and how embedded, to the extent to which that the independent officer is embedded at the provider or works from here, or we need to work that through. And that's one of the early conversations we will have with both the provider and the person appointed to the job.
What we really require is to make sure that there's ample time for those two different entities. They work together effectively, agree on the process very clearly, testing regime to make sure that you don't have the kind of problems we had. I think it was associated with ballot papers and the equipment.
Yes, there was a coding problem.
Yeah. So because 2-3 hours, finishing or announcing final results way beyond midnight, when you started sort of lunchtime is just not acceptable. Yeah. Thank you.
Assemblymember Berry.
So the final question about the e-counting process, I think you've largely covered in terms of our main recommendation being that there should be random manual counts carried out. And that's in the spec that you've given to the contractors, but you don't know exactly how they're going to do that yet, so you presumably can't answer any further questions about that.
I mean, one of the points about rewriting the specification quite comprehensively was, one couldn't be absolutely sure how, it's not an enormous market out there, how people would respond, or whether one of the more gratifying things from all the bidders actually was that they'd obviously read your report as well pretty carefully, and were full of sort of bright ideas. So whether it's sort of saying, yes, of course we'll build manual sampling into the methodology. Yes, we're going to have bigger, better, faster screens at the count centre that people, they definitely responded. Of course, the task now is to hold them to that and to ensure that their proposals are practical and work, and that's what we'll be doing.
Have they said who have you specified, or they said who would be able to ask for a random account sample to be taken?
Anyone can.
And the direction of CRO.
Yes, well, we do need to give some more thought to it, and we do need to talk to the constituency returning officers about it as well, because I think probably what we need to achieve is something that is consistent, and that, you know, because this was a concern, that whichever constituency candidates are standing in, we deal with a manual sample in a consistent way. I think that would be what I would say.
Okay, but the idea is that it's a quality control, an internal quality control measure, more than it's something that agents could ask for example.
Yes, and it's something that people can watch.
So you're saying that agents could ask for it?
Well, I think. Well, we haven't had this conversation yet, have we? I think that
maybe we should come back to it.
I think they possibly can. I think the part of the idea is it's a sort of visible way of helping ensure the integrity of the count, isn't it? So, but we'll need to think about how it works in practice.
Yes, it's a sample only, because that's the other thing.
Yeah.
And I think it is to demonstrate the integrity of the process. So, a sample gets counted manually, it also gets counted electronically, and the results are the same. That would demonstrate the integrity of the system.
But just add to that, within the specification, we've asked for additional reports to be able to be run as well to be able to satisfy that integrity question. So there'll be enhanced reporting as well to help that.
Okay. And the final, one more question about, there were issues about the screens on which questionable votes were how visible they were to agents and observers. Is that dealt with within the new spec as well? If you've got bigger screens in general, that should be helpful.
Yes, I mean, one of the things, so, technology jumps every 4 years, so in theory, you're going to have faster scanners, bigger, clearer screens. Those are all the kinds of things that are being promised and talked about, so now we need to get down to the detail of the contractors about delivering that.
And more screens as well. Sorry? More screens as well.
Because people hobbled.
Yes, indeed.
And are you having an independent observer scheme? I know there has been in the past, there wasn't last time.
I think others decide that, don't they? Yes. I think whether the Commission will send some independent observers.
No doubt they will, certainly the Commission, plus others. Accredited observers, people can apply to the Commission to become an accredited observer, independent of any political persuasion or party.
Okay, I'll follow up on that.
Okay,
Thank
sorry.
I can see some requests.
Yes.
I thought we paid for that.
Okay, we're going to move on to one final quite important subject area, actually, and Assemblymember Copley is going to deal with that for us.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is about the possibility or the lack of possibility of a recount. And does it concern you that as the Greater London Returning Officer you have no ability, no power to call for a recount in the event of a very close mayoral vote?
Well, I don't have it, so that's how it is. And it's very, very difficult to.
I presume this is this must be a risk that you've identified, and is there anything that you can do to mitigate it? Short of trying to persuade the government to change the rules.
Yeah. Well, they're not going to. Well, certainly not for 2020. And I think that the mitigation is all in the quality of the processes and the systems that get us to the result.
Right. So things like the manual samples and being able to demonstrate that they tally up with.
Yep, it's an important part of that.
With the electronic
constituency level.
At constituency level, that's right. That's right. So it is. The London election is counted as we know at a bigger area level, of course, the constituency level, and so we just have to make sure that every bit of the count process is right and is getting to the right result.
Did you want to go in, Alex? Sorry.
You can make that point. Sorry, it's rather obvious that because we do have electronic vote counting, that if you accept that that vote counting is accurate and the manual sampling bears that out, then arguably you have a greater level of assurance in the event of an extremely tight race that you wouldn't have if you were counting millions of votes manually. But obviously, yeah, for people to accept that in a tight call, we'd need to be absolutely confident that the electronic voting had worked, and the manual sampling would hopefully help with that.
And of course, if we end up with a situation like last time where you can't get the things to tally, then that will also serve to undermine. Is there any potential for candidates who, let's say a candidate lost by a few hundred votes, would there be the potential for legal action? Or is it just simply final once you've made the declaration?
Well, the results are challengeable by petition, as in any other election.
Yeah.
One of the things that is open is that a constituency returning officer can have a recount, but only for that constituency. So in the event of what Assemblyman Copley has been talking about, is there any scope or provision for you to be liaising with constituency returning officers in advance of the election, and along the lines of, in the event that it is this close, we can pick numbers later, it might be advisable for each of them to order a recount in their area? Because surely, I think the point that Assemblyman Copley is getting at is that the integrity of the outcome is absolutely paramount. It's never happened before, but...
Yes. So this was the case when I was a constituency returning officer. So there was a discussion in the months ahead about how close a result might have to look like for it even to have a discussion about a recount. And if any constituency returning officer was even thinking about it, they would have to talk to me on the day. And so we'll establish some protocols for some thresholds around, well, if you're in this threshold, then we should probably have a conversation about it. But if you're not, there's no conversation to be had.
But the election is pan-London. So let's say for the sake of argument in the North East constituency, overwhelming victory for one of the mayoral candidates, but across London it turns out to be knife edge. You would still, in the event of recount, need to recount the whole of London. So if it were left just to individual returning officers to make that decision, you wouldn't get a recount. And the outcome of the election could be called into question, couldn't it?
But this is the problem.
So I think my challenge to you is will you be speaking to returning officers in advance of the poll about the aggregate outcome of an election and seeking their cooperation to order recounts in the event that the outcome of the overall poll is within a particular margin?
But I can't do that because...
well, you can have informal conversations.
We're going to have the conversation, yes.
You can't order them.
Conversation about recounts. But of course, the other problem, of course, is, remember, that these counts, the constituency counts, finish at different times. Mm-hmm. And so certainly, up to now, once you've declared your constituency, and I did this in the South West, you stand your team down, everything's packed away, everyone goes home. So...
You can't wait for them all. You can't wait for all 14 to get the results, send them to you, then you tally them up. They have to declare them first. Which is why this issue of recount is at constituency level only. But of course there will be conversations. We will have the conversations with the constituency returning officers about that, of course, and we will establish some agreed ways of working around the day itself and what type of conversations are to be had before people pack up and go home at constituency level.
Okay.
But that is the issue. So by the time you get to the last one, everyone else has gone.
I have a further question unrelated to this, but related to the declaration. This is a quick one.
I've seen something Prince. Is it on this?
I'm going to pass, actually.
You're going to pass.
No, it's more of a staging thing, really. Having done two of these now, and the first... in 2012, they declared the mayoral result, and everyone left, and then they declared the list members, and we all came up, and there's no one in the room. Last year, because of the delay in the mayoral result, they did us first, and then the mayor. And not that I want to disparage the office that I hold, but I think declaring the list members last is a bit of an anticlimax. And I wonder whether staging it so that we're declared first, we go out, and then they do, you know, let's face it, the contest which attracts the most attention declares that. And it also means that we don't have to come onto stage to what is literally an empty hall. So it was just a suggestion, really, more than a question of whether that's possible.
Having been a list member myself, I'd like to endorse Assembly member.
Fuel is we do
I've now passed on that, and I got my declaration 7 hours earlier than the time before. But, okay. Did you want to answer that?
So do we hear the suggestion?
Sorry?
I hear the suggestion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so members, we've reached the end of our Q&A session, so can I recommend that we note the answers given?
Indeed.
And thank our guests
Agreed.
very much for attending. We will write to you in the normal way afterwards. There's various bits and pieces of information that we've picked up that we will ask for in writing afterwards, but this will obviously be something that will be ongoing. I think you suggested at the outset that 6 months from now might be another good time to do a reality check.
If you would like to.
Which I think we will almost certainly do. I mean, the chairing arrangements will have changed by then because we'll be into the next municipal year, but of course it will be a year from the election, so it will be a very appropriate time to do that. So I think that we will probably take that up. Okay, members, item 6 is the consultation on the proposed revisions to the statutory officer protocol. I'm going to take this paper as read unless any members have questions.
Agreed.
Okay, in which case, thank you. Notice the report. Item 7, Secretariat Quarterly Review for Quarter 2. Again, I'm going to take that as read unless members have questions.
Agreed.
Can we note the report? Thank you. Item 8, the work programme for the GLA Oversight Committee. Can we note that?
Agreed.
Item 9 is the date of the next meeting, which is Tuesday the 11th of December 2018 at 10 o'clock in the chamber in here. Now, item 10, we've been given notification of an item of urgent business. I've agreed to accept this paper. It's entirely up to you. We're going to run through this fairly quickly.
I don't think it'll be long.
So perhaps if we just get through the meeting, it will only take a few minutes. So I will read you the relevant statutory declaration I need to make. So I have, in accordance with section 100B(4) of the LGA Act 1972 as amended, accepted the report circulated under a supplementary agenda as an item of urgent business in order to consider the matter at the earliest possible opportunity. We are requested, can we consider whether to establish a working group with the following terms of reference? To consider, on behalf of the London Assembly, any additional information now available in relation to the Garden Bridge project and related matters, to report back to the GLA Oversight Committee on those matters at the earliest opportunity. And if we do agree to do that, we're asked to agree the size, membership, composition and chairing arrangements for the working group. Assembly Member Copley, this report is here, as I understand it, very much at your urging. Would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I would, thank you. I mean, in some ways this would be a tidying up exercise based on the scrutiny that we've already done, but there are some new information since the sort of main piece of scrutiny that the Oversight Committee did. We of course had the release of the Garden Bridge Trust's minutes. I think one of the key issues we want the working group to consider relates to why the TfL officers who are serving on the Garden Bridge Trust, who obviously were party to the information in the minutes, trying to get to the bottom of what they were then saying to people higher up in TfL, because it was clear from what was in the minutes that things didn't seem to be going particularly well, and yet large sums of public money was still being handed over. We also want to look at the role of the Charity Commission, which of course ultimately is the regulator, and any additional issues surrounding contracts. TfL is currently considering whether or not to release further taxpayer money, £9 million worth, which the trust claims it is entitled to. So I think this is still very much an issue that warrants the Assembly's scrutiny. And do you want me to discuss the proposed composition?
Well, my understanding is that because it's a working group rather than an official subcommittee, we are entitled or able to disapply proportionality. Am I correct on that? Mm-hmm. Do you have a proposal,
well, based on the understanding that the GLA Conservatives didn't wish to participate in this, I was going to propose 2 Labour members, 1 UKIP member, 1 Green member, and a Liberal Democrat member.
Okay, do you have names?
Myself, Assembly Member Duval, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Berry, Assembly Member Whittle.
All the Assembly members named content to serve on this group?
I know that Len and Caroline are.
Yes, Len is.
Yeah, okay. Assembly Member Whittle? Okay. We need to agree the chairing arrangements as well. I mean, that could be done at the first meeting, although we could delegate it now. Is there a proposal to chair the committee, subcommittee?
Proposal was that I would chair the committee.
That's what I understood.
Yep.
But I haven't discussed that with any other members. But
Well, our members content that Assembly Member Copley will chair this working group.
yeah.
Agreed.
Okay. The only other thing that needs to be discussed is the timeline. Do you have a thought on that, Assembly Member Copley, as to when the working group will meet and when it will report, or should we delegate that
I
to
think we
group
need
leads?
to delegate that to group leads.
Are members content that we do that? The group leads will oversee or agree a timeline and a meeting schedule?
Agreed.
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 Okay. Well, with that, members, that is now agreed. The meeting is closed.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound.